the quiet work of monks, copying the world word by word. When you think about history, your mind may leap to kings, armies, revolutions, or plagues. Yet, in the long centuries of the Middle Ages, some of the most persistent and quietly influential figures were not warriors or rulers, but monks, men who spent their lives in cold, dimly lit rooms, copying words one line at a time. Their efforts were not spectacular. They did not march across battlefields or build towering castles. Instead, they bent over parchment for hours each day, dipping quills into ink, shaping letters with slow precision. And it is their patient work, line after line, page after page, that ensured much of what we now know about the ancient world survived into our time. This story begins in the scriptoria, the writing rooms of monasteries across Europe. Imagine stepping into one. The air is heavy with the smell of parchment, beeswax, and soot from lamps. Wooden desks line the stone walls, each lit by a small flickering flame. A monk sits silently, wrapped in a coarse wool habit, his shoulders hunched as he pulls a quill across stretched animal skin. He pauses often, not because he is distracted, but because each letter must be shaped carefully, each curve and line precise enough to be read centuries later. A mistake does not mean simply crossing it out. Parchment is too valuable for that. Mistakes must be scraped away with a sharp knife, leaving faint scars that will always betray the error. The rhythm of such work was slow, almost glacial. A single manuscript could take years, sometimes decades, to complete. You might expect this tedium to drive one to distraction, but monks believed this act of copying was more than preservation. It was devotion. Every letter written was an act of worship. Copying sacred texts was considered a way of imitating divine order, each curve of the script reflecting the perfection of God's creation. Yet the same hands that copied the Psalms also preserved Aristotle, Virgil, Cicero, and Galen. In those quiet halls, the works of pagan poets and philosophers were saved by Christian monks who saw knowledge itself as too precious to lose. But before the copying began, there was preparation. Parchment, made from animal hides, had to be carefully produced. Sheep or calf skins were soaked in lime to remove the hair, then stretched on wooden frames, scraped thin, and left to dry. The result was a durable surface, smoother than paper, that could last for centuries. It was not inexpensive. A single large manuscript could require the hides of dozens of animals, meaning books were costly objects even before a quill touched their pages. Ink, too, was handmade. Gallnuts gathered from oak trees were mixed with iron salts and gum to produce a dark, lasting stain. Quills were cut from goose feathers, sharpened with knives to a precise nib, and trimmed again and again as they wore down. Before a monk could even begin the sacred labor of writing, days of preparation ensured that every material was ready. And then came the copying itself. Imagine the sound inside a scriptorium, the scratching of quills across parchment, the occasional cough, the creak of wooden benches as monks shifted in their seats. Silence was expected. Conversation would break concentration, and concentration was vital when the task was so painstaking. Light was poor, especially in winter months when days were short and candles could only do so much. Shadows pooled in corners, and the faint golden glow of wax flames danced across the surfaces of half-finished manuscripts. The work was hard on the body. I strained, backs bent, fingers cramped. Yet the copying continued. It is important to remember that this was not only a European phenomenon. Similar practices occurred in Byzantine monasteries and in the libraries of the Islamic Golden Age, where scholars translated Greek works into Arabic. Knowledge traveled strange and winding paths in these centuries. A text might be copied in Constantinople, translated in Baghdad, preserved in Spain, and only then reintroduced into Western Europe centuries later. The slow, repetitive act of copying, so dull in the moment, became the fragile chain that carried ancient wisdom across ages. One might ask why this mattered. Why did a monk, hunched over in a cold cell in the year 900, matter to us now? The answer lies in what would have been lost without them. The works of Plato and Aristotle, the histories of Tacitus and Livy, the medical writings of Galen and Hippocrates, all risked slipping into oblivion after the fall of Rome. Papyrus scrolls disintegrated in damp climates, libraries burned, and wars scattered collections. Yet monks, working line by line, ensured survival. When you hold a printed copy of Virgil today, you are looking at something that exists because of centuries of manual copying. Without those boring labors, the Renaissance, the rebirth of classical knowledge, could never have occurred. Monastic copying was not uniform, however. In some monasteries, especially wealthy Benedictine houses, scriptoria were large, structured, and organized. Dozens of monks worked at once, each assigned different tasks. Some ruled parchment with faint guidelines to keep the text straight, others copied, while still others corrected mistakes or added illustrations. In smaller or poorer houses, perhaps only one or two monks would work, copying whatever text they could acquire. Sometimes manuscripts were lent or traded between monasteries, carried along muddy roads by traveling brothers who might take months to deliver a single volume. Every text was rare, fragile, and valued like treasure. We must not forget the illuminations, the colorful illustrations and decorated letters that sometimes adorn manuscripts. While not every book contained them, those that did reveal a world of artistry hidden within monastic silence. Large capital letters blossomed into vines, flowers, or animals, often painted with crushed minerals or even gold leaf. In these details, one can glimpse not only devotion but imagination, a quiet rebellion against the monotony of the task. Though most monks copied text word for word without change, illuminators allowed themselves small moments of creativity, a rabbit nibbling at a vine, a face peeking from behind a letter, even humorous doodles hidden in margins. These marginalia remind us that even in silence and devotion, monks were human beings with humor and curiosity. The pace of life in monasteries reinforced this labor. Days were measured not by hours but by prayers, the divine office dividing time into segments of chanting, prayer, meals, and work. After morning prayers, monks might copy until midday, pause for food and more prayers, and then resume again until dusk. Their lives were repetitive, but in that repetition lay order, and in that order, preservation. Copying was not an interruption to prayer. It was itself a prayerful act. Yet there were burdens too. Some monks complained about the physical hardship. In marginal notes, scribes sometimes left small laments. "Oh, my hand," one wrote. Another admitted, "The parchment is hairy," when he encountered rough vellum. Still another scribbled, "Thank God it will soon be dark," signaling both relief and exhaustion. These voices, tiny glimpses across time, remind us that behind every book is a human being, tired, straining, but persisting nonetheless. As centuries passed, the cumulative effect of this quiet work became immense. Libraries grew within monasteries. At Monte Cassino in Italy, at Cluny in France, and at St. Gall in Switzerland, vast collections emerged, some numbering in the hundreds of volumes. That might not sound like much compared to a modern library, but in a time when each book required years of labor, such collections were extraordinary. These libraries became centers of learning, attracting scholars who sought the wisdom preserved there. In many ways, monasteries became the universities of their time, repositories of all that remained of the ancient world. But the world outside monasteries was changing. By the 12th century, cities were growing, trade was expanding, and universities were emerging. Manuscripts produced in monasteries began to circulate more widely, copied now not only by monks, but also by professional scribes in urban centers. Still, the tradition of careful, devotional copying endured, its legacy echoing even as printing presses loomed on the horizon. At this point in the story, you may wonder, how many texts were lost despite all this labor? The answer is sobering. Historians estimate that perhaps 90% of classical literature has been lost forever. What survived is only a fraction, preserved largely by accident of geography, chance, and the steady patience of copyists. Entire works of drama, poetry, and philosophy are known to us only through references in other surviving texts. When a monk chose which book to copy, that decision shaped what we know of antiquity. Their choices, often practical and unremarkable at the time, set the boundaries of human memory. And so, we return to the scriptorium, where a single monk bends over parchment, quill in hand, eyes tired but steady. He does not know he is saving Aristotle. He does not know he is shaping the course of the Renaissance centuries later. He is simply doing his duty, copying line after line in silence. His world is small. The flicker of the candle, the scrape of the quill, the scratch of wool against his skin. Yet in that smallness lies survival. The world we inherit is built not only by conquerors and kings, but by such small acts repeated endlessly. The long journey of the manuscript, from monastery to university. If section 1 of this story invited you into the dimly lit scriptorium, section 2 draws you further into the long, winding journey that manuscripts took once they left monastic walls. What was copied with devotion and labor in a quiet abbey cell did not always stay there. Books traveled, sometimes slowly and carefully, other times hidden in chests, sometimes carried across battlefields, and at other times exchanged for favors or even ransoms. Their survival depended on these movements, and it is through this long chain of human handling that knowledge trickled forward into the medieval and early modern world. Leaving the monastery, when a manuscript was finally completed, it was not simply tucked away. Monasteries cherished their collections, but books were also part of networks. A monastery might lend or exchange volumes with another abbey, ensuring that texts spread across regions. For example, the Great Library at Cluny Abbey in France was not only a resource for its own monks, but also for visiting brothers from other houses. When these visitors returned home, they often brought with them a copy of a text, either newly written on site or commissioned afterward. Travel was slow. A monk on horseback, carrying a wrapped bundle of parchment, could take weeks to move a book between centers. Roads were poor, banditry was common, and weather easily ruined fragile cargo. Books were valuable enough to warrant protection, sometimes even being carried in special boxes or covered in wooden boards wrapped with leather to shield them. Even so, water, fire, and accident remained constant threats. Catalogs, libraries, and the care of books. One overlooked detail of this world is the development of library catalogs. By the 10th and 11th centuries, larger monasteries began keeping lists of their holdings. These were often written in plain inventories, with titles listed line by line. Catalogs served not only to organize, but also to prevent theft or misplacement. In an age where one missing manuscript could mean the total disappearance of a work from history, such record-keeping mattered immensely. Libraries themselves were rarely grand rooms. In many monasteries, books were stored in cupboards or small rooms off the cloister. Some were even chained to desks, not because monks feared one another, but because books were so precious they could not risk loss. In other places, volumes were wrapped in cloth and stacked on shelves, their spines often blank, since early manuscripts were not bound in the way modern books are. Instead of titles visible on shelves, one had to open them to see what they contained. From monastic schools to universities. By the 12th century, something began to change in Europe. The growing towns of Paris, Bologna, and Oxford gave rise to a new institution, the university. These were not monasteries, but rather urban centers of learning, where students gathered to study law, medicine, theology, and the liberal arts. And for their studies, they needed books. Suddenly, demand for manuscripts increased beyond what monasteries could provide. New copying centers arose in towns, often employing lay scribes who were paid to reproduce texts. This gave birth to what is sometimes called the Petius system, particularly in Paris. A master copy of a book was divided into sections, and multiple scribes worked on copying different parts at the same time. Once each section was finished, they were bound together into a full volume. This system allowed faster production, though fast, remained a relative word. Books still took months to assemble. In Bologna, where law was studied intensely, vast numbers of Roman legal texts were recopied and spread. In Paris, theology dominated, with Aristotle's works, translated first into Arabic, then into Latin, becoming central to debates. The texts monks had preserved in silence for centuries were now read aloud in lecture halls, commented upon, debated, and argued over. The words of Aristotle, Cicero, and Galen gained new life, no longer confined to silent parchment, but spoken in classrooms filled with restless students. Margins filled with notes. One fascinating feature of university manuscripts is their marginalia, the notes students and masters wrote in the blank spaces around the text. Unlike the clean, devotional copying of monastic scriptoria, university manuscripts often bear crowded commentary. Lines of glosses snake around the central text, filling every available inch with arguments, references, and counterpoints. A page might contain Aristotle's words in the middle, but the voices of dozens of medieval scholars surround him, debating across centuries. This practice of commentary turned books into living documents, repositories not just of ancient knowledge but of ongoing medieval thought. In a way, these manuscripts became miniature conversations, with voices layered one upon another. Reading them now, you glimpse not only the preserved text but the minds of medieval scholars wrestling with its meaning. The slow spread across Europe. Even with this expanded copying system, books were never abundant. To own a single manuscript was a mark of wealth. Universities often kept official copies, and students rented time to consult them. Wealthy patrons, including nobles and bishops, sometimes commissioned copies for themselves, but such volumes were rare luxuries. Still, knowledge spread. From Paris to Oxford, from Bologna to Salamanca, texts migrated along with students. Young men traveled across Europe to study, often carrying books with them. These volumes were sometimes gifts from patrons, sometimes family heirlooms, sometimes purchased at great cost. The result was that by the late Middle Ages, texts once confined to isolated monasteries were now circulating widely, shaping the curriculum of Europe's first universities. The role of translation. At the same time, translation movements brought new texts into the Latin West. In Spain, particularly in Toledo, scholars translated Arabic works into Latin. Many of these Arabic texts were themselves translations of Greek works preserved by Islamic scholars, but they also included original contributions in mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. Thus, manuscripts copied by monks centuries earlier joined new arrivals from the Arabic-speaking world, expanding the library of knowledge available to Europe. This merging of traditions, Latin, Greek, and Arabic, was critical. Without the preservation work of monasteries, the translation efforts in Spain, and the demand from universities, Europe's intellectual revival would not have occurred. All of it rested on parchment, quills, and the patient act of copying. The fragile fate of books. Yet, for all their importance, manuscripts remained fragile. Fire destroyed many libraries. The great library at Cluny Abbey, once filled with treasures, was reduced to ashes in later centuries. Water, mold, and neglect claimed countless more. Wars scattered collections. During the Viking raids of the 9th century, monks sometimes fled with books hidden under their arms, choosing manuscripts over gold when they abandoned monasteries. In other times, books were used as bargaining chips, pledged for debts, or even stolen outright. The fate of any given manuscript was always uncertain. That we have as much as we do is remarkable. The survival of texts often came down to chance. Which monastery happened to be spared from fire? Which abbot decided to copy Aristotle instead of ignoring him? Which student bothered to take a volume home? Toward the printing press. By the 15th century, manuscripts had reached a peculiar moment. They were more abundant than ever, flowing into universities, cathedral schools, and noble libraries. Yet at the same time, they were about to be overtaken by a new invention, the printing press. This invention would render the slow work of the scribe obsolete. But before we reach that moment, it is worth pausing to consider what had been achieved. For nearly 1,000 years, monks copied in silence. Traders carried manuscripts across roads. Universities reproduced and debated them, and translators added new voices to the collection. This vast chain of effort meant that when Gutenberg's press finally appeared in the 1450s, there was something to print. Without the long centuries of copying, there would have been little left to preserve. And so, you are left with a question. What was lost in those fragile centuries between the fall of Rome and the rise of the press? How many works slipped away because no monk chose to copy them, no library chose to protect them, no student thought them worth studying? The end of the scribe and the dawn of the printed word. The final act in the story of manuscripts is not so much their disappearance as their transformation. After centuries of slow, painstaking copying, the invention of the printing press in the mid-15th century altered the landscape of knowledge forever. Yet this was not a sudden replacement. It was a gradual shift. For decades, scribes and printers worked side by side, their worlds overlapping as one method of preservation yielded to another. Section 3 of this story takes you through that transition, how monks, students, and scholars experienced the end of the scribal age and the beginning of printing. The last generations of scribes. By the early 1400s, the monastic scriptorium was already less central than it had been in earlier centuries. Universities and professional town scribes had taken on much of the copying. Still, monasteries continued to produce manuscripts, often for their own use or for patrons who desired something devotional and unique. These last scribes worked in an atmosphere that was both reverent and precarious. On the one hand, they were the inheritors of a centuries-old craft. They continued to grind pigments, stretch vellum, and patiently form letters in neat rows. On the other, they were increasingly aware of competition. Booksellers in cities like Mainz, Venice, and Paris began offering new volumes that could be produced in weeks rather than years. A monk might labor for months on a psalter, only to see a printed version appear more quickly, with dozens of copies available at once. What must it have felt like to be one of those final scribes? To dedicate oneself to a tradition of hand copying, only to realize that one's work could be replaced by movable type? The question lingers across history, much as it does today when crafts and trades meet new technologies. Gutenberg's revolution. The invention of movable type by Johannes Gutenberg around 1450 in Mainz, Germany, is often described as a turning point in human history. But in reality, the press did not spring fully formed. It was shaped by centuries of manuscript tradition. Early printed books, or incunabula, literally cradle books, often imitated manuscripts in their layout, typeface, and decoration. Printers deliberately made their books look familiar to those accustomed to handwritten volumes. Margins were wide for notes. Initials were left blank for illuminators to fill in, and the black-letter type resembled Gothic script. The first major product of the press, the Gutenberg Bible, was both a marvel and a statement. Produced in around 180 copies, it demonstrated that printed works could rival manuscripts in beauty while surpassing them in consistency and speed. Some copies were even hand-illuminated, making them nearly indistinguishable from traditional volumes. The press, it seemed, did not reject manuscript culture but grew out of it. Manuscripts and printing together. For decades, the two systems coexisted. Scribes continued to copy texts, particularly those that printers were not yet producing. Many religious houses still valued the act of hand copying as a form of devotion. Even after printing spread, manuscript production persisted for private prayer books, ceremonial volumes, or specialized texts that printers considered too niche for mass production. At the same time, printers focused on works that had broader appeal: Bibles, classical authors, legal codes, and grammar texts for students. The university system, which had once strained under the need for books, now embraced the flood of printed volumes. Students who once rented access to a single copy could now purchase their own texts, albeit still at considerable cost. This overlap created a fascinating hybrid world. You could walk into a library in the 1470s and find shelves filled with both handwritten and printed works, sitting side by side, their coexistence signaling a moment of transition. The fate of manuscripts. As printing spread, manuscripts faced new destinies. Some were preserved carefully, recognized as unique artifacts of earlier centuries. Others were recycled, their parchment reused for bindings, their pages cut apart and employed in household accounts, or their leather covers repurposed. In an age of efficiency, not all valued the older, slower technology. Many works survived only in fragments because someone in the 16th century thought a strip of vellum was more useful as reinforcement for a ledger's spine than as a page of Cicero. Yet, paradoxically, the arrival of the press ensured that many manuscripts' content survived. Works that existed in only 1 or 2 copies could now be multiplied, reducing the danger of total loss. The fragile labor of monks was safeguarded by the durability of print. a changing world of learning. The printing press did not just preserve, it transformed. Texts became standardized, making it easier for scholars across Europe to debate with one another, since they were reading from the same words. Errors that crept into manuscripts over generations could now be corrected. The reach of books expanded, seeping beyond monasteries and universities into the homes of merchants, artisans, and eventually even peasants. By the late 15th century, printing centers like Venice produced thousands of volumes each year. Printers became entrepreneurs, choosing which works to publish based on anticipated demand. The world of the book was no longer confined to monks and scholars. It was now tied to commerce, literacy, and, in time, mass culture. The echo of the scribe. And yet, even as printing took hold, the image of the scribe lingered. In paintings, manuscripts continued to symbolize learning and authority. The act of writing by hand retained its aura of devotion and authenticity. Some scholars continued to prefer manuscripts for their individuality, their artistry, and their sense of connection to tradition. For centuries afterward, illuminated manuscripts remained prized possessions of collectors, symbols of a world that was already fading. If you hold a medieval manuscript today, you touch not only ink and parchment, but the ghost of that earlier world, the quiet of the scriptorium, the patient hours of a monk, the fragile chain of survival that carried the text forward. Without them, printing would have had little foundation. Without printing, manuscripts would have remained scattered and vulnerable. Each needed the other, in ways their creators may never have imagined. The reflection: as you drift through this story, you may find yourself considering a quiet paradox. The scribes who spent their lives copying by hand may never have imagined that their efforts would be superseded. Yet without their devotion, the press would have had nothing to print. In a sense, every printed book owes its existence to centuries of boring, careful, monotonous copying. The ink of Gutenberg's press sits atop the invisible foundation of monks who worked by candlelight, one line at a time. So, when you next think of the invention of the book, remember the thousands of hands that came before. How many of those scribes knew they were writing the last of their kind? How many sensed, as the first printed books appeared, that their way of life was quietly passing into memory? And perhaps the deeper question is this: in our own time, when new technologies emerge to replace old, what crafts are we watching fade, even as they prepare the ground for what comes next?